Awesome. So thank you all so much for coming today. I am Heidi. I'm with the town of Los Gatos, and I am part of the PLP Staff Development Committee. They're the ones who host this workshop and also our fall workshop, which is the Future of Libraries Conference, which is super fun. We do have the date set, so save the date. That will be on September 29th. It's at the Correct Auditorium in San Francisco. When you leave today, you have a survey, and this survey is not only for this workshop, but it helps us develop ideas for that Futures Conference. So if you have a colleague who's doing something really incredible that you think we should all know about, drop that down for us, either with your contact info or that colleague's contact info, so we can get a hold of them. Also, if someone in another industry is doing something really cool that you think would work in libraries that we could replicate or we could partner with, that would be awesome to know, so we could bring speakers in for that. So we're super excited to have with us today two exceptional speakers. They will provide with us some insights today and some tips and tricks that we can take back to our everyday jobs. So our hope here today is that you get useful tools you can take back, you can implement right away. Both Sarah and Penny are leaders in the field of library services to children and teens. Penny, who's here in the black, has been a children's librarian for more than 25 years. She's performed thousands of children's libraries, conducted hundreds of school tours and assemblies, and led many, many book clubs. Sarah has been in libraries, she's right here, for more than 20 years. She's authored both books and articles on young adults and teen services in libraries. Her passion for this age group is contagious. Please help me welcome both Penny and Sarah.
Thank you so much. We're excited to be here. We did this yesterday, so we have a good idea how much time things take, and it seems people really enjoyed it. And it is interactive. I'm not going to stand up here and talk and bore people for an hour. If you have questions, please let us know. They are videotaping, so I'll either repeat the question or I'll run the microphone over to you, so that will be, your question can be picked up on the video. Kind of the plan for today, this is what we're going to be covering. We did the introductions. We're going to go over child development by age group, the concept of the age of reason in a young child. When can a child be left alone? Children with special needs, a reference interview in the child. We're going to do a little exercise for that. And so this is going to take between 9:15 and 10:15. Then 10:15 to 10:30 we'll have a break. Then at 10:30, Sarah will take over to talk about teens, tweens and teens, middle school and high school, because there is overlap in the middle school years between the children's section and the young adult section in most libraries. And then the last half hour we'll get together and talk about helping parents. All right? And as you can probably hear from my voice, I have really bad allergies today. So at some point you might hear me take a sip, just so that I can get rid of some of that. But I'm not contagious or anything. All right, let's see. I think that's the main things we wanted to cover. And then so we'll go right into young children. And like I said before, during it, if you have a question, interrupt. I'd rather do that than wait till the end. We're so glad to be here. The session, if you think about it, is really about the best customer service to families. And to do that, we need to know our library users. And so we need an overview of child development by age group, so we know what children are capable of at different stages. An understanding of developmental stages of childhood is important when serving children in the library or any other situation. Knowing that there are developmental reasons why children may not be able to express their needs or work very efficiently in the library can help us be better listeners and be more patient with our young customers. And it removes any pre-existing filters, and we can set aside some assumptions, and it'll make our interactions more effective. So the whole idea is not just that you can give better customer service, but so that your job is easier. So for early childhood, which is generally ages 3 to 8, that age group is typically in the library with an adult caregiver, and members of this age group take great pride in their accomplishments. So encourage children to help you in finding books. Now, they might not be able to use the keyboard and need you to use the online catalog, but let them watch what you're doing, let them talk to you about what they want, and they will really appreciate being able to achieve helping find their own books. I try to do that instead of just handing people things, where they're part of the whole process. Now, 8-year-olds are also part of the next group. So when we talk about young children, ages 3 to 7 or 8, and then our next group is later childhood, which is really sometimes 8 to 12. Depends on the child. Later childhood, ages 8 or 9 to 12, that's when a child often is in the library without an adult. Think of your average 4th and 5th grader who stops by the library on their way home from school, for example. Or if they are in the library with an adult, the adult has often gone off to look for their own items, because a 9 or 10-year-old can go to their section to look for their own items. And the members of this age group tend to be very good at concrete problem solving, and they're industrious and take initiative. So they like to be the ones sitting at the catalog with you, helping them, maybe helping them spell the word, or even helping with what is the right word to look up for their subject. That kind of thing. So let them take the lead, and then you assist. And then young adolescents, which for me is middle schoolers, that's about 11, 12-year-olds, and they also will use the young adult section, so even Sarah's going to talk about them a little bit too. But middle schoolers enjoy making their own decisions. They're younger teens. They like to separate from childhood, show their independence, and not be treated like a little kid. Very often, their parents or other adults, like teachers or librarians, can show them the results of their choices. Could be negative and offer some other choices, and that is fine. And they'll appreciate offering those suggestions, but that's what they want, is suggestions, not being told what to do. Like, I suggest you do this so I don't have to ask you to leave. That kind of thing. And they really appreciate it when people come across to them as non-judgmental, because middle schoolers feel like they're being judged every second of their life, as you can imagine if you remember when you were 12. And later, Sarah's going to talk even more about this age group, because they have some unique brain development and other developmental issues. So that kind of gives you an idea of what a child you can expect from them at certain ages. Also, when they're in the library, it helps to know about children and their needs. Studies by people like Abraham Maslow, Erik Erikson, and Jean Piaget, or other child development experts who founded this as a science. They had an understanding of children's needs, cognitive abilities, and their moral and social development. And so this understanding can help us when we're selecting the kind of books and reading related activities that will be most satisfying for this age group. Each of these authors outlined a hierarchy of needs for different age groups. This is a way for a shorthand way for us to know what a child at that age is trying to do with their life. So for age under 6, they're trying to achieve autonomy. Ages 6 to 9 are developing initiative. That means let them help you find things. Those ages 9 to 12 are industrious. They like to do it themselves. And young teens are establishing their identity. That's why a lot of them will change their appearance and things like that. If you think about it, preschoolers say no quite often. That's because they want to be autonomous and in control of their own person. And That's also why teens can come across as rude. They're trying to establish their identity as a young adult. And so they are sometimes a little overly forceful. But don't take it personally. They're just defining who they are. Another thing that can help you be successful in waiting on children is know that they like choices. Just like with adults, children should be offered a variety of materials when they ask for things in the library. I always provide books that would be both above and below that person's age level or reading level. A person comes in, they're a second grader, that's about 7 years old. Some of those kids can read Harry Potter cover to cover. Some are still reading very basic green eggs and ham type of books. So kind of get to know the child and offer them lots of choices. I think this is especially true of nonfiction. A lot of kids and adults like nonfiction books that are filled with photographs, what adults call coffee table books. So if a child is coming in and they're interested in books about a certain nonfiction subject, either for homework, like history, or they like to read about cars, offering books with lots of photographs, even if it's above their age level, is really helpful, and that might be what they choose. And also, if you offer lots of choices, they won't leave empty-handed. If you only offer them one thing, it might not be a good fit, and then they'll just leave the library with nothing. And that's not usually what any of us want. I think a big part of waiting on, especially younger children, is to find out what's called the age of reason. And that child development specialists talk about as a child who's reached the age where they can navigate society without a caregiver. For example, a child about 7 or 8 starts being able to be without an adult because they realize who a stranger is and how that could be dangerous to them. On a 5-year-old, that's not usually the case. So the age of reason is the age, again, when a child can be on their own and be safe. They can distinguish right from wrong, reality from fantasy, and make good judgments and control their own behavior. And if you watch any TV shows that have jury trials and things, you think about it when they'll have a story involving a young child. Children are not very good at testifying until they're about age 8, because then they know this was reality. It wasn't something from my imagination. This really happened. And that's so age 8 is a good guess of what's the age of reason. Also, if you think about it, our schools divide elementary school into primary grades and then the upper grade level, 4th and 5th. So if the schools have decided kids 3rd grade and lower are primary grade, that means they need a smaller class size and they need a lot more supervision. The rest of us in society can use that as our goal as well, because schools are so dominant in how families decide what children can do. And so age 8 is about that dividing line. Any other ideas about the age of reason, or what an age a child could be kind of on their own without an adult? Or anybody have? We're going to go into that a little bit more. Yes?
I'm wondering, how does this relate to the current controversy about free-range parenting?
I'm so glad you brought that up. He just asked a question about what's called free-range parenting, and we're going to go into that just briefly, shortly, because I know that's been in the news, and that is something that we want to address. So, as we move on to more about the child being left alone, most libraries have guidelines for when a child can be without a caregiver, an adult caregiver. It doesn't always have to be a parent. And often they use the guideline that the child has to be the age of reason, which is about 8 years old. And the other thing that's a big thing to stress is that it's for the safety of the child. It's not because a 5-year-old is misbehaving. It's more that a 5-year-old can't be there without an older teenager or adult to make sure that they're safe. So most libraries will have a procedure for a young child left at the library without adult supervision, or a child left at closing time. And so it's really important that you know whatever your library rules are on that. Those are very important. No matter where we are, almost every library has to deal with latchkey children, suburban libraries, large urban libraries, because working parents figure that a lot of kids, 9, 10, 11, don't need to go home to a babysitter, but they maybe go to the library to study till the parent gets off of work. And we want children using the libraries. There's a lot of kids do have homework that takes up that whole time. But when children are in the library, they finish their homework and used up all their computer time, which very often is an hour, then they're left at the library even after that. They're bored, they misbehave, they're just hanging out, which means they take away library seating and space from other people, so it becomes a barrier to other people having access to the library. So latchkey children can be a challenge. And so some libraries will have homework centers to deal with a large latchkey population. They'll have things like board games and other things for the kids to do when they finish all their homework and computer time. So you have to figure out what your library is going to be doing about that. It can't be a decision you make on your own. For most libraries, it's a policy decision. Did you have any questions on that? I see some skeptical faces, so I don't want you to hesitate to ask me a question if something seems like you want to challenge. I think that's a great idea. So we have to decide at what age can a child be left alone. Many libraries establish age guidelines for unaccompanied children in the library. Most of the libraries that I looked at, their policies are on their web pages, which makes it really easy. And some of them are on the handout that we gave you. Some good policies you can look at if your library doesn't have one, or if your library hasn't revised it in a long time. There's some samples on the handout. But most of the libraries I researched, the age was about 8 years old that a child could be in the library without adult supervision. But some libraries are starting to set a higher age group, middle school on up, and it's all because of the safety of the child. So you want to know what the rules are at your library, and because we want to be consistent. We don't want one day it to be 5-year-olds and the next day it to be 10-year-olds based on whoever's working that day. And I know in our city when we did all these policies, our city attorney had to look at every one of them and okay them. So that is probably likely in your case as well. If a child under that age limit is left unattended, often the first step is to call the parent. The child can call the parent on your phone, or you can call the parent. Sometimes you can find out that if the child has their library card, then the phone number of the parent is often in their record. And we let them know what the rule is and that they'll need to come and pick up the child. Because very often that rule is broken, not purposefully, but because the parent didn't know the rule. And I also think it's important not to, in a way, reprimand the child. It's not them that's breaking the rule, it's the parent who told them to go there. And I try to deal with the parent. It's really not the child's fault when that happens. It's the same rule for the child left at closing time. You want to have procedures and policies on what to do. And very often that's making sure that the child can call to get picked up and that the parent even knows what time the library closes. If this happens more than once, you want to be sure to start documenting it so that you find out it's not an abusive situation where the person is consistently left at the library under age 8. Very often they're hungry and they're scared. So in Castro Valley, the Alameda County system, their policy says leaving children under the age of 8 violates their policy, and the responsible person has to be at least 16 or older. In Oakland, they prohibit leaving children 7 or younger unattended. And I personally think 7 years old unattended in a library, especially a big city library, even though Oakland's children's room is relatively isolated, if you've been there, it's in the basement. I think it's a little bit scary for a 7-year-old to be on their own. But that goes into that free-range parenting you were talking about. If you saw the news about the free-range parenting, what it was a 10-year-old and his 6-year-old sister were at the park and walked home, and they lived in a city, and the police thought that seemed odd that those children weren't accompanied by an adult. And the adult said, we want our children to be confident, to be able to walk around and do things. So it was more an issue that the 10-year-old wasn't old enough to be responsible for a 6-year-old. That was really more what it was about. And that will often happen, that a very young child is left with somebody that maybe the library policy states cannot be responsible. They're not old enough. A 9 or 10-year-old sibling might not be responsible for a 5-year-old. So those are the kind of things we want to look at. I think what you have to remember is if your library can have a policy, then that's just your job, is to communicate that to the parent. And if they have issues with it, what's nice for you is you can say, well, then you have to talk to the supervisor, and you're off the hook. But it is something I think that's going to happen more often because of the publicity of the free-range parenting concept. So I'm really glad you asked that question. Thank you. Here in San Jose, their policy is a little different. It says young children may not be left unattended anywhere in the library, including areas designated for children. A parent, guardian, or other responsible adult must accompany any children who cannot communicate their first and last names, their phone number, and the first and last name of the person who brought them to the library. You'll notice that nowhere in there does it say what age that is, because every child might be different in their abilities. And it goes on to say, when staff is concerned about the safety and well-being of children and young adults, they cannot assume responsibility for them in the absence of a parent. So even if you have some older children, like middle schoolers, that are misbehaving, this rule says you're not able to be in the library and follow our rules. And if you consistently break them, we might require that you come with an adult for a while until you're able to come here and abide by the rules. And that could be a rule, something you could say to a parent of a 12 or 13-year-old, especially if they're doing vandalism, stealing, especially from other library patrons, things like that. Another thing you'll have to deal with sometimes is behavior problems. And even though children ages, especially 10 to 13, are in the library unattended, they may misbehave due to boredom. That's at least my experience. That's often why kids act out. You can feel confident about telling any age, including adults, that are breaking the rules, that they have to follow the rules. Doesn't matter what their age is. I think that's a good way to go. We'll tell no matter if it's a senior citizen who talks loudly. This happens a lot in libraries because they socialize. They've come there for the book club, and then they come out of the book club and are in the quieter part of the library and are talking loudly. You can ask them to lower their voice, just like you would a group of teenagers maybe working on a group project if they're in an area of the library that should be more quiet. I think it's good to be flexible in the children's and teen area to allow more talking, because as many of you know, curriculum right now with Common Core is requiring students to work a lot more on group projects, and so you have to talk. It's just the nature of it. So I think enforcing the rules no matter what age is really a good example for children, because children really care about fairness. As you have heard, if you own one, any of you have a child, that's not fair. It's a common thing that even teenagers say, not just little kids. And so they respect when things are fair. That's why if it's a written rule, it's even better, because they understand that because of school. They might not like the rule, but if it's a written rule, they understand that's how it goes. And that's the way society works. So that's a good thing to have. No matter what a person's age is, staff deal with behaviors that interfere with not just your work, but can create a barrier to access of others, like really rowdy behavior. Some people will stop using the library if nobody controls the rowdy kids there after school, for example. So we want to make the library welcome to all ages. And to have the rules enforced fairly is the way to do that. I think setting reasonable limits are really good for latchkey children. A common restriction is you have to be using the library materials if you're going to be taking up our seating. And that can include you doing your homework or playing the board games that we've left out in the children's room. That kind of thing is a normal rule. Some libraries partner with their local schools to enforce rules. If kids are hanging out in the morning of a school day, often the staff will check, with the child, shouldn't you be at school? You will want to know what the schedule is. Some schools, like Catholic schools, might have different holidays than the public school, things like that. So you want to know what's going on. At my library that I worked at in San Leandro, if it was high schoolers, we didn't intervene. High schoolers had a really different kind of flexible schedule. So you might have a 14 or 15-year-old in the library right when we opened because they didn't have a class in the first block. That was normal. But kids 8th grade and younger who were there on a school day, we would sometimes check out what the deal was. And the two things that were a violation of both their school rules and the library rules, if you're a child and you're not in school, you cannot be in a public place like the library if you're suspended or if you're sick, unless you're with your grown-up. So you have to decide, you have to find out what your library does. Our library partnered with the school district to enforce those rules. Some libraries don't. So you have to find out what the rule is. But it isn't odd or unusual for a school to mandate that a child who's suspended or sick needs to be with a caregiver. They can't be on their own at the shopping mall, the movie theater, or even a place that's educational like a library. Yes?
Is it your duty to enforce that if it's not a truancy situation or if it's not a legal thing?
That's an excellent question. I want to repeat that because she said if it's not a truancy thing, they're not cutting school or they're not sick or suspended where they have to be with an adult. Do you intervene? We usually did not, and we had a more strict partnership with schools than the others. There were certain children who would not go to school because their religion had a holiday, but it wasn't a holiday for the whole school. And usually they were very clear on that. We're not supposed to go to school today. It's our religion's holiday, and they would talk about it a little bit. And then we didn't intervene. I think when it's a real issue is when you consistently have a child, 8th grade and lower, who comes to the library on a regular basis because they're homeschooled, but they're not with a parent. And we've had a few incidents where the parent basically said, I'm homeschooling you, but they sent them to the library every day from the minute we opened till 5 o'clock at night. And after a few days of that, we had to intervene and explain, if you're homeschooled, you need to be with that homeschool teacher. We can't substitute for school unless you're there with your homeschool teacher. And in those cases, we help facilitate that they could reserve a study room and things like that. That's an excellent question, thank you. So you want to check out what your library policy is on that.
Question?
Yes.
What kind of wording, or have you seen any wording around sick children coming into the library with their parents? Oh, I'm homesick, I have a fever. But
If you're with your parent, it is different because sometimes they have gone out to the doctor or the dentist and they decide not to go back to school for the rest of the day, but they're coming to the library to pick up some materials because they've got homework. So if they were with their parent, we usually didn't say anything. We did have people that were sick who had things like chicken pox, and they came to story time, and then we would, have you all had that happen? And then we would talk to the parent one-on-one and explain, we appreciate that you value story time, but unfortunately, this will affect the other children in story time. So let me help you find folks to check out and come back when you can't pass that along to anybody else. Yeah. Has that happened to anybody else? Yeah. Or we had somebody drop on you? Yeah. You're a children's librarian long enough, it will happen. Do we have another question? That was great, thank you. All right. Let's see, where was I? Okay, now we'll go on to safety. And this includes your safety, by the way. Library staff should never feel unsafe at work, no matter whether the threat comes from an adult or a young person. And our city, in fact, realized that we dealt with dangerous people in some way more than some of the folks in their police department. Because a busy city library will have mentally unstable adults who use it that you have to deal with. So they give us special training on calling 911. And of course, you think about it, we teach even 3-year-olds 911. But the 911 operators gave us a short workshop on what they have to ask you so that you would be ready. Because very often when you're calling, it's a very stressful situation. And so if you already know what you're going to be asked, you'll be much more prepared when you call 911 and the phone call is shorter and you can get a response faster. So that's something your library might want to do too. Yes?
Question, when you are saying you're contacting the parent, we don't have, we can't require a child to give us ID, right? So they can give us any old name they want. And we can't necessarily contact the parent always, so we are having to discipline kids how to leave the library. How do you notify parents if you don't have?
Well, I don't know about you, but our library's computers, you have to log in with your library card number. And so it's pretty, oh, I'm sorry, I'll repeat the question. She asked about kids who won't tell you their name or their phone number or their parents' name or phone number. There's a couple situations, and I have to be frank, I was a children's librarian so long in my town, I knew everybody. And they knew me. They'd known me since they were preschoolers. So they were pretty okay about it. So I actually haven't had this happen very often, but often I could get their information from when they logged in on the computer. Because I could go to the master computer and look it up. And also depending on what the situation was. You know, sometimes you can deal with them one-on-one. But if they did, where they stole something from another library patron, threatened somebody, things like that, they can either tell you that, or you can call the police and they'll intervene. You have to decide the level, you know, that you're dealing with. And also the age of the child can make a difference. If they're younger children, they really do have to have the parent involved. And that's another situation where if they really won't tell you, and that is rare for younger children, like 11 and younger. They're used to adults asking them that. Teenagers can be a little different. So I'll let Sarah talk about that in a minute. But I usually can get their phone number from them or look it up on the computer. But if it's an older teenager and doing something so egregious that I wasn't just asking them to leave for the day because they were a little loud, but they were harming other people or threatening other people, then that might be a case where you'd have to call the police. Every situation is different. It's hard to answer. But there's not always an easy solution. But you should feel safe, too, in the library. So that's an important aspect of it. One way for staff to feel safer when they're dealing with behavior issues with children is to work in pairs. Sometimes it's really a thing you can do by yourself. You can walk over to a group of middle schoolers working on their homework together and they're laughing and talking. Can you guys keep it down a little bit? And you don't have to have another person. But if you have to take a person, and usually I would try to take them in a private office, whether they're an adult or a teenager, because you don't want to embarrass people. I like having another person sitting there just as a witness. And we always did things in pairs. And the police department told us to do that. Even when it's something that you're not banning the person from the library, it just looks better if you're talking to people in pairs. And I worked in a really small branch for a while, and sometimes there was only 2 of us, but luckily I had trained volunteers there pretty much all the time we were open. So I'd even have a trained volunteer just sitting there, listening, not talking, not interacting, but it helps them having a witness. So that's one thing you can do to make yourself feel safer, is have a partner when you're talking in a serious situation about reprimanding somebody. And I said before, it's often not the child's fault that the rule's being broken if their parent sent them there or didn't pick them up at closing time. So then I really want to talk to the parent and not blame the child for the parent's issue. And it's usually not. And in almost all cases, it's because the parent didn't know the rule. So be sure to check with your supervisors and know what your library's policies are. I know I've said that 10 times, but that is the bottom line for everything. Know your library's policies and use them. That's what they're there for. They're there to help you. If you have to do something that's more than just asking somebody to be quiet or quit goofing around, and you have to ask them multiple times, start documenting that, because you might need that later if you are going to be asking somebody. You really can't have no self-control. You might need to come to the library just with an adult for a while. And it's good to have that documented, just like you would in a school situation. Write it down. I've had to ask you every day for a week because you broke this rule. So at this point, I just can't do that every single day. We're going to need to get your parent involved. So if you have it written down, that's the way to go.
A question on that?
Yes.
Just, I guess, another way of the question about the identification. If you have like middle schoolers who aren't necessarily on computers, but their language has been foul and you taught them like 3 days in a row, or they're lying on the tables or whatever, and they give you different names every day, but you don't have a way of getting a name because it's, off under. We have an incident log, we try to describe the person, but one of the safety officers told us not to try to take their pictures. What kind of suggestions do you have for trying to document incidents where you really don't have a handle on this person? You're trying to get to know them, but they still tell you different names.
We were always successful. If we had a few times where we had a situation like that, we were able to call the local school, because we kind of knew what school they came from, to come after school to help identify the person. That worked out really well, because especially the middle school, we used to call them yard duty people, but now they're called something else. That sounds more fancy. Security intervention officer or whatever. It was a lady named Tina.
The principal actually gave us a copy of the yearbook, so you might, that's a place, it still doesn't necessarily, they change from year to year, amazing about
Yeah,
that.
so that's a great suggestion, get the yearbook. But often you can have somebody from the school come and they'll know the child's name and they'll help partner with you. And we've also had really success with partnering with principals at both the private schools and the middle school, where we knew that the kids were from, identifying children and helping us enforce the rules. And what's nice about that is they can say, we can give you a bad grade on your deportment, even if it's not at school, it's at the library, because we're responsible for you until you get home from school, and you've made us look bad. Catholic schools love to say that. So that's another thing that can help you. When you have a really frustrating situation, the schools will partner with you, because they are, I don't know if you knew this, our city attorney told us this, the school is responsible for the child until they make it home from school. So if the children does something wrong on the way home, the school looks bad. And so they'll want to make sure the child changes their behavior. Now I want to talk about children with special needs, because we want to be inclusive. We want to make sure that they enjoy the library, they have fun, and that they use the library. But some disabilities like autism can have a feature where the person talks loudly or makes noise, and it isn't something that they can control. So I always urge people in the children's department to be more flexible about that. It's a disability, and so we want to be inclusive. And so if you're in the children's department, it really isn't bothering other people. Actually, kids are really tolerant of other kids like that, much more than adults are, in my experience. So let's try to be inclusive and make sure children, if they have a disability that makes them make noise, be flexible about that. Help the parent find a place where that's not going to impact other people, other adults so much, and it should work out. Let's see, and also I think it's important that we convey to parents of children with disabilities, especially autism, that they're welcome at our story times and other programs. That could include a wheelchair seating at your library magic show or whatever, puppet show, but also let them know at our story times that we have lots of songs and other things that they should feel welcome at. And also that if the child, all that stimulus gets too much for them, that they can come to just part of story time and then leave if they become overwhelmed, and that we're okay with that. Because a lot of parents are still very hesitant to bring their children to story times, especially because they're afraid that they'll get yelled at. So we want to convey that the opposite is true. Some libraries are finding they have such a large population of children with autism, they're doing sensory story times that are designed just for children with autism. So you have to figure out if that is what you need. But I always say, be inclusive of your other story times too. We want to have that as a regular kind of mindset, that our library includes everybody. Our summer reading program, children of all abilities are welcome. That's all you have to say. And then a parent whose child has a severe disability and cannot read yet by themselves is still welcome to participate in the summer reading program, just by saying that one phrase. Children of all abilities are welcome. Has anybody had a really successful way of outreaching to families with disabilities? There's a lot of things you can do, including going to schools and other organizations that serve these families and talking to parent groups, just to remind them that the library is welcoming and we are accepting of children who make noise in the children's department especially. So not to worry. Going to, sometimes having your flyers at doctor's offices and hospitals, things like that. And I try to add elements to the story time that make families with disabilities feel welcome by having toys. Some children need to hold something or play with something for them to be able to sit and listen. So we have a lot of stuffed animals and puppets that they can touch during the story time. And there's a lot of other advice, and there's some resources on your handout that will include some other things. Because I think it's something libraries have to be more proactive about in outreaching to families with children with disabilities. Our next section, I want to talk about reference in the child. How do you help a child? What do you do when you can't get the child to kind of explain what they need? Children come to the library to find books for homework usually, as well as just reading for fun. And they deserve the same customer service as an adult does. In some cases, I find them easier to work on. Maybe that's because I'm used to kids. But I think they can be less evasive, and sometimes they're more straightforward because they know exactly what they need because it's a homework assignment and their teacher told them. Whereas sometimes adults can be kind of vague, in my estimation. So once you become accustomed to serving children, you'll find that they're a rewarding group to serve in the reference experience. They express excitement and thank you when you help them, unlike some other people. But they're not many adults, and that means that sometimes they can't express themselves very well, the way an adult sometimes can be very clear about what they want. So often, if you've done reference training, no matter if you're a paraprofessional or a librarian, they'll encourage you to ask open-ended questions at the reference desk. But sometimes with kids, that doesn't work very well. It doesn't mean it's a bad thing, and you can try those open-ended things. But often, some of you work at a library that there's only 2 or 3 of you, you're answering the phone, working the circulation desk, and doing reference. So you can't go through all that open-ended question, especially with a kid who knows exactly what they want. It's their homework assignment, and you're saving both of you a lot of time by asking some straightforward questions. And adults may ask, where are the cookbooks? You can show them the Dewey Decimal section, but children often are more specific. I need a Native American recipe for my 4th grade report on Ohlone Indians. And they're really specific, and that's great. Sometimes they're very vague. So you never know. So you try to elicit as much as you can by asking the questions you see up here. Sometimes the child is asking for materials that's actually for a sibling, so you want to know that. You want to know what grade they're in, because children can be tiny and be an 8th grader. And children can be as tall as I am and be a 4th grader. You never know. So I ask what grade they're in. Is it for homework or for fun? And do they have the assignment in writing? Did they write it in their notebook or have a handout from their teacher? But even if you don't have a handout, I will still help you, don't worry. I always try to say it that way. Because if you say, do you have a handout from your teacher, and they say no, sometimes they are thinking you're not going to help them. So I try to make it, if you have a handout, that helps, but if you don't worry. Say it that way. They'll appreciate that. And I also do more follow-up. Even in that super busy situation where you're doing like 10 things at once, with the kids I try to check back within 5 minutes. Is this going to fit that homework assignment you were asking about? And give them another opportunity if it really won't. Because some kids, not all kids, but some kids will be hesitant to come back and say, you know, this isn't really going to fit what I needed. Some kids are good and assertive about doing that, but a lot of them are not. So we want to give them an opportunity to ask for that. Another thing that can help you is to know that children may not use their library time efficiently. Many of us have seen children run after school, run straight to their computer and play whatever game they want to play. And usually most computers, most libraries give an hour on the computer. I don't know if that's yes, no. 2 hours, yeah. So if you come straight after school and you get 2 hours on the computer, suddenly your mother is honking a horn outside in the parking lot of the library, which I always think is hilarious. You're honking your horn. This is not New York City taxi. This is the library parking lot. Did I say library? And they're honking the horn, and the children know, I have 30 seconds to run outside or my mom is going to leave without me. And they'll run up and say, I have to have that book on volcanoes for my homework. You know, we've all had that happen. Because they see an empty computer and they will jump on it. You know? So kids won't always use their time wisely. And so I will often say, next time, even if you're at the computer, let me know what you're going to need so we don't have to do this again. We don't have to rush. And if you said that to an adult, they'd probably be offended. But if you say that to a kid in a kind way, they know you're just trying to help them, and they will sometimes remember that. And in fact, at this one library I worked at, it was a large branch library that was real close to a middle school, a Catholic school, and another private school. And it was packed after school, and there was only 3 of us that ever worked at one time. And I'd go around to the computers where the kids are playing games. Did you need any homework books too? And check with them. Because I knew that those moms were going to be outside honking their horns. Or especially at Fridays when we closed at 5:30. And I didn't want to rush around at 5:25. Didn't matter to me. So I'd walk around to the computer and double check. Did you? And then they often would say, yeah, I have to have such and such. I said, I know exactly, I'll bring it over. No big deal. You know, it made my job easier. You know, why not? Now, younger children may not be able to tell you whether or not what you gave them is going to work for them. Sometimes you have to check with the parents as well. Sometimes you need to leave the books on the table for about 5 minutes and check back and say, is this okay with you, or is it a little too hard to read? Do you want something easier, or is this way too easy to read? Do you need something more difficult? I always would check with the children, especially second graders all had to do a planet report. And we had some pretty good planet books that even a first grader could read. But I'd leave several on the table, let them look at them, and double back. Because if a child was just learning English, they needed the super easy planet book. Or if they were the kind of second grader that could read Harry Potter, they would want a more challenging one. So I always gave them a few minutes to kind of try on the book like you try on shoes for the kids that are just learning how to read or just moving into reading independently, and that will help. So make sure that they get something they can really use. Also, another concept that could be hard for kids is to know that they can ask for more than one thing at a time. If you're a waitress in a restaurant, you wouldn't go find out what the drink is. What do you want for this? What do you want for that? What does each person want? Go get that one person, come back. No. Same with kids. You have to show them. If you need more than one thing, you can ask for it all at the same time. I need a homework book about volcanoes, and did you need anything else? You need also like a silent reading time book, a book to read for fun. Yeah, I need one of those too. Well, let's go look for both of those things. So even though they've only asked for one thing, while you're looking for that one thing, double check. Did you need something else for any other class or any other assignment, or for silent reading time or to read for fun? And very often, so that they wouldn't have to come back and ask you again. Because some kids will be too shy to do that, and sometimes you don't have time. So if you are proactive in asking that, that can help save time. Whether books or online resources or for fun or for homework, we can help children satisfy their needs and encourage them to use the library in the future by doing that. They'll see you as an ally, as a friend. When they get that big homework assignment, they'll think, oh, that lady helped me with my last one. I'm going to go to her or him. Reference interaction with the child can vary from a quick question, where are the joke books? Here they are, to something more involved. So even though it might sound like a quick question like, where are the joke books? As I'm walking over there, I'll be chatting. We have like joke books like knock knock jokes, things like that, riddles. Do you also need like a chapter book that's funny, like Diary of a Wimpy Kid? Because maybe that's what they really meant. So when they ask for something, kind of chat to see if that's really what they meant. Kind of think outside the box based on what a few words were, and you can kind of get an idea of what they really need. Or maybe they'll just take more books because you've talked about something like Diary of a Wimpy Kid that's really popular. And we've talked about the questions you ask, what grade you're in, things like that. Also, I would try not to say, may I help you? Because then you get the no thanks or just looking. I try to ask, did you find what you were looking for that homework assignment? Or at the very initial, is this for homework or for fun? Do you need a homework assignment type of book? Because that's something that they can, then they'll say, oh yes, I do need this and this. I think may I help you sometimes is not a good way to get into it. So try that. And also try to walk around. I know some of us have service desks that don't let you do that very well, but I try to walk around as much as I can because I think that lets you help people that are too shy to come to the reference desk. Children don't like to interrupt people on the phone. I know you're thinking, not my kid, but a lot of children are trained not to interrupt an adult on the phone, and a lot of us are on the phone or looking at the computer. We need to stop when we're listening to a child, that kind of a thing. And we're going to talk a little bit more about body language and things like that when we talk about parents. And speaking of body language, good customer service is eye contact, smiling, try not to be on the phone. And this is a big one. Try not to be typing on the computer or looking at the computer screen. You have to look at the person. And also, even though you are really busy, try to appear patient and unhurried. That will also help the interaction go better. And of course with kids, it's important not to cross your arms or have your hands on your hips, because that sends a signal that you're being interrupted. And for some kids, that's a real big barrier. So what we want to do right now is have a short exercise. And what we're going to do is just take 5 minutes and get in pairs. And this is what you're going to do. We're going to take turns. So for the first 2 minutes, one person's the reference librarian, the other person's the 4th or 5th grader who's come to the library to ask for something about homework. You can make up whatever you want. And kind of do a mini reference interview. What questions would you ask? how would you get to find out what the child really needs? And then switch. And then the other person's librarian, the other person is the 4th or 5th grader. And then after, in about 5 minutes, what we'll do is get all back together and hear back of tips of things that worked for you, questions you ask in a reference interview, or the kind of questions, homework type things you get asked, and how you have to get to what do they really need. So those are some of the things that we're going to do. So the clock here says it's 2 or 3 minutes after, so we'll go to about 10:08, and then we'll get back to get your answers, and then we'll have a break at 10:15. Now let me get back together, and because of the videotape, and I'll hand this mic off to you if you want to talk. What are some positive things that really worked for you when you do a reference interview with like a 4th or 5th grader? A way to start the conversation, for example, or different other things?
I was just gonna say, I learned it's good to like crouch down to their level and, you know, directly talk to them rather than like talking to the parent about them.
We are going to talk about, in the parenting section, what's called a helicopter parent who takes over the conversation. But yeah, and a lot of us work at like a CERT reference desk if you work at a small branch, and just the height of the desk is a barrier. So that's another reason walking around is so good, because you can't pull up a chair and be more on their size level. Any other positive ways you found of starting a reference interview or things to ask? Or you guys all dwelled on the negative ones? I really try to stay away from may I help you, because that doesn't work. So I'll start sometimes with just chatting. How's it going? Was school, have a good day at school? Something like that. And then did you need any homework type books or materials today? Once you've asked them how school was, that can sometimes work too. Especially because you see a lot of the same kids over and over, depending on the size of your library. Any other people have a positive thing to share? Good, oh good.
Well, the person I was paired with, and when I was a child and they were the librarian, was very helpful because I was supposed to be doing a diorama on ancient Egypt, and she not only helped me find the books, but she helped me think of some ideas of what to do, because I didn't have any shoeboxes at home, and it's due tomorrow, and so the different places I might get a shoebox. And then she also even offered, and I thought this was above and beyond, possibly some cardboard or some craft materials from her supplies if she had some extra, since it was an exception of trying to do it ready for tomorrow and thinking ahead next time.
I'm so glad you brought that up. A lot of us grew up in the library world where you couldn't even ask for an eraser without having somebody give you the stink eye. You know, and it's just an eraser, it's just a pencil. So a lot of libraries are finding that kids coming after school do need some materials, and you can get donations. The Friends of the Library will help pay for some of that. So having construction paper, cardboard, markers, things like that to help kids with their homework is really valuable to a lot of our families who maybe don't have those things at home, or the kids get finally home and it's too late to work on homework by that time. So that can also make the library a really welcoming place, is have some of those basic school materials. Anybody want to talk about a funny thing that didn't work? And then maybe we can all come with a solution? Yes, oh, I'm going to pass the mic over to you, great.
Well, the most daunting reference question I ever had from a kid was, I want a book. And I was like, okay. And he says, about a kid. And I said, can you be a little more specific? Is there a particular book? No. It's like, well, can you tell me more about which one? I want a book about a kid who did stuff. And that's all I could get out of him. So.
And what grade were they in?
4th, I think. Yeah.
Hatchet, Harry Paulson.
So I just pulled out a few and
Yeah.
gave to him, but it's like, that was the hardest question.
Yeah, sometimes you'll get something that's a reader's advisory type of thing, and it's hard to figure out. I mean, reader's advisory is like picking out clothes for somebody you don't know. You know, so sometimes when you get that really difficult thing, there's always those like 5 books everybody likes. You can always start with those, and then sometimes that will get them Yes, but there are some children that are really hesitant to talk. And we just, give them lots of choices, and eventually something will hit. Any others? Oh. Because we all have like those horror stories. And in my experience, usually happens when I'm so busy I'm not a good listener.
This was just to follow up to the last one. If the child, like an adult reference to Reader's Advisory, the children the same thing. Do you remember a book that you liked?
Yeah.
So if he or she read a book about a kid, it might be that you found out that actually he wants a next series of Wimpy Kid.
Right.
Or it could be that you know that they really liked Ramona, you might suggest Clementine or something. So anyway, that might be another question to find what they read before or liked.
That's a great idea, thank you, yeah. Sometimes it's just that one word that will kick off something else in your mind. Any others? Oh, everybody has only happy experiences? I'm shocked. My favorite is a high school kid who came in and he said, I need a book on Felix Whitley. This really happened too, and I'm kind of embarrassed about it. Felix Whitley, he was very clear, he knew exactly. And I looked and I said, we don't have anything. Looked it up in the encyclopedia. This was before Google. I'm that old. There is nothing. Is it a famous scientist? He goes, no, it's for my U.S. history class. Felix Whitley, talk. Do you have it written down? Do you have it from the teacher? He goes, I don't think so.
Phyllis Wheatley.
And it was Phyllis Wheatley. And he did have it written down phonetically, but once I found, and he had written Wheatley instead of Whitney, because I kept thinking, is it Eli Whitney? No, but it was Wheatley, and once I got that, so even though they say they don't have it, a hand up from their teacher, sometimes you can ask again, did you write it in your notes maybe? And sometimes they'll remember that they did, or they'll look at their notes at least and have maybe one word. So that also can help. So even though they said, no, I don't have it written down, say, well, do you have your notebook from class today? I wonder if there's a little clue there that we can find out what the teacher really wanted. That kind of a thing. Sometimes you'll have teachers who will assign something and you have nothing at all because the teacher's trying to be creative, which I appreciate. Unfortunately, books aren't published on what the teacher creatively wants to do with an assignment, sometimes.
So who was he?
Yeah, and well, we had a teacher who created this whole unit for third grade all about horses, which is odd because we're in an urban area. And I like horses too, but we couldn't find anything easy enough. So you never know how it's going to work. And so, and of course this was before computers as well, because that can help, because sometimes you can find a computer website at least and do a printout. So those kind of struggles we've all gone through, and a lot of it is just being a good listener, being supportive, and what's lucky is that nearly all the time homework we have books that relate to it, because publishers know what people are assigning, and especially now with the Common Core, they know exactly what's going to be taught at which grade level. So they'll do books on that grade level, on that topic. Those series books from Abdo and other publishers. So that's a good thing. So what we're going to do right now is have our 15-minute break. So we'll come back at 10:31, and then we'll go on and talk about teenagers.
Are we on? There we go. Okay. I'm Sarah Flowers. I worked for the Santa Clara County Library for most of my career. I was deputy county librarian when I retired. I spent a lot of time at the Morganville Library, where I was a supervisor and then the manager of the library. I also actually started at the Los Gatos Library as a YA librarian. And I have been involved all that time with YALSA, the Young Adult Library Service Association. That's ALA's Teen Services Division, including I had a term as president of YALSA. YALSA thinks of their kind of age range for teens, for young adults, is 12 to 18, so that's kind of what I use, although some of what I'll be talking about, will apply to like the 11-year-olds, 12-year-olds, the kind of the younger end as well. Just a little bit of a commercial plug, and that is that Penny and I teach, respectively, the Children's Services and teen services courses for info people. They're 4-week online courses that are offered every year. That we get librarians as well as support staff. It qualifies, if you take both courses, for ALA, APA library support staff certification. So we have things that are aimed at people who are not necessarily MLS librarians, but we do have plenty of librarians that take the courses. Penny's is usually offered in the fall, mine's usually offered in like February, March. I just finished a session, but if you're interested in learning in more detail about any of the topics we're talking about today, that's a really nice, kind of non-threatening, easy, like 4-week online course to get a lot more information and resources. So that's my commercial plug for that. So look, we talk about tweens and teens, and like I said, we're talking about that whole range of 11, 12, up through 18, and you have to remember that lots of changes are going on during that time period in teens. So there's a big difference between a 12-year-old and an 18-year-old. So here's Chelsea Clinton at 12 and at 18, and obviously lots was going on. And then just for fun, Pottercast. When they started, they actually were 11 and 12 in the first movie. When they're 17 and 18, it was probably around the 4th or 5th movie. They were in their 20s by the time they did the last movie, but that was when they were about that age. So, a lot is going on. And we tend to talk about teens as, the hormones are raging and all that kind of stuff. And hormones is part of it, but the biggest thing that is going on with teens is the stuff that's happening in their brains. Brains of teens are going through major changes and remodeling. And I think if we can understand what is going on there, it helps us be more understanding and empathetic, not take the reactions of teens personally, which I think is one of the big dangers in dealing with teens. So let's talk a little bit about the teen brain. I don't expect you to be able to read all this, but just to kind of give you an idea, the brain, even though teenagers may well be full adult size by the time they're sometimes even as young as 13, but 14, 15, 16, and we used to think that meant, well, their brain is full size, so their brain is fully developed. It's not. It is still growing. There's major changes that are happening, and the changes for the most part start in, as you all know, different parts of the brain are responsible for different things, and the growth kind of moves from the back to the front. And the front, right here, in the cerebral cortex, is where all the stuff happens about judgment, reasoning, organization, all that kind of stuff that we think of as maturity. And that part of the brain is really not finished until maybe 25, sometimes a little younger, sometimes as late as 30. I mean, it's really not, when they're teenagers, they're really not finished growing. But some of the other things like coordination and vision at the back of the brain, those come earlier. This is the limbic system, the amygdala, the kind of the reward center of the brain. And that, as you might know, is very active in teens. That's one of the places that they really, that the reward system of the brain really is primary ahead of that judgment center. So let me think. So one of the things, like I said, that's happening in the brain is the teen, that all the synapses, all the connections and all that kind of stuff, the stuff that gets used in the teen years gets strengthened. It's like strengthening a muscle. It's like exercising. And the stuff that doesn't get used, those pathways kind of fall away, which is one of the things that really calls for doing a lot of things when you're a teenager, trying out a lot of different stuff, because it starts to develop those brain paths. That's why doing music and doing art and that kind of thing will develop some of those paths that might not, that it's harder to do later in life. Other thing that happens as far as that reward center, the emotional system, the amygdala and that, is that there are kind of two ways that as humans we react when something happens, when we have input. And there's kind of the fast way to our emotional response and the slow way. The slow way is what most adults do, which is something happens, and even though this process happens much faster than I can say it, we analyze it, we think about it, we realize, oh, this is what's happening, this is what's going on, we're reasoning here, and then, so this is the proper emotion to have, for that. With teens, it's much more likely to hit that emotional thing first, emotional reaction first, and then maybe later I'll do the reasoning part. And so that's why we get some of the reactions that we get with teens, even under calm conditions, even in a non-emergency. And we all see that in an emergency situation. We all can react emotionally first. Well, teens will often do that even in a non-emergency situation. So, what is happening, and this starts early, even in the 10 to 11-year-old, is that part of that development is that they're moving from the concrete to the abstract. And you know this about little kids, very concrete. They're very literal, all of that kind of thing. Whereas by the time they're 10, 11, 12, into that, they're starting to be able to generate big ideas, to be able to consider multiple points of view, this idea of the abstract. That's why it can be very difficult, the whole idea of abstract thinking, to, for example, teach algebra before about the age of 13 or so. Some kids are ready for it earlier. Many are not. Even at that age, they're not, they haven't quite got to that abstract part. And the same, the multiple points of view, that's why by the time you get to middle school and high school, they can teach literature and talk about, the characters and kind of expand that in a way that you can't do in the younger grades. They're also beginning to learn to develop goals, planning, strategy, but again, that's that cerebral cortex thing, which, yeah, they're learning to do it, but they're certainly not experts at it yet. And understand nuances. This is when they can really start to get jokes, more sophisticated jokes. How when the second grader or the kindergartner tells you the knock-knock joke, and they think it's so funny, but they don't actually really get why it's funny. By the time they're at this age, they get why it's funny, they understand, and they start to develop a little more sophisticated jokes. The other thing that happens at this age, because they are working on those ideas and that kind of abstract thing, is that they are beginning to, they really love to argue. And it seems to us like they're arguing for the sake of arguing, but if you think about it, what they're really doing is exercising those newfound reasoning skills. They're able to see those hypotheticals a little bit better. And, it can be really tough for us, and especially in a library when you're in a hurried situation or whatever, it can be hard to sort of pull yourself back and think, well, he's practicing his reasoning skills, and, I could help him by pointing out some other possibilities here, and, that kind of thing. But it really does, it requires patience, but it really, actually, you are helping them do that, and it's one of the things in the library that we can do is help them work on those reasoning skills. The other thing they're doing is always picking apart what adults say. They're learning to think critically, and so they're like hyper aware of when adults are inconsistent or hypocritical, contradictory, when there's discrepancies. And that's why it's really important to be consistent at this age, at all ages, I think, and certainly in the libraries, one of the things we want to do is set rules and follow rules. But this is where they really can get you, and that's why you want to make sure that when you're that you're not kicking someone out of the library for something one day and then giving them a pass the next day, because then they're going to push it and see, well, okay, she said that, but she didn't really follow through on that, so let's see where we can where we can push it next, and maybe she won't follow through on that. Maybe she gave me 2 choices, but maybe I could push it to 3 or 4 choices, and until it gets a little closer to something that I want. So the consistency is really important. One of the other things that happens is Erik Erikson says that the primary job of the adolescent, primary question of adolescence is, who am I? And to kind of extend that, it's who am I, who do I want to be, where am I going? And that's why we see a lot of experimentation and looking at identity and trying on different identities at this age. We get the rebelliousness, testing limits, and looking for new ways to express themselves. It could be in clothes or hair or makeup or the getting involved in something, whether it's drama or band or whatever. But it becomes a case of, this is who I am. This is the person that I am. And I think the thing that we have to remember is that just because they're doing that at 12 or 13 or 14 or 15, it actually doesn't really mean that that's really who they're going to be for the rest of their life. They're still trying on things. And it's great. They can do that. It's relatively safe because they're still living at home and that kind of thing. There could be downsides, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. The other thing that's happening, because they are at this level of identity, is increased self-consciousness. And so they're sensitive about their bodies and the way their bodies are changing. They are easily embarrassed. They frequently compare themselves to their peers. They sometimes compare themselves in ways that, we know about peer pressure. Sometimes the peer pressure is their own perception of their peers. It's not even necessarily real, and they'll tell you, and this is, again, you can bring in that experience of the reasoning skills by helping them reason through that. Really? Every single 7th grader is wearing, this particular brand? Every single one. You looked around your class and, well, okay, so maybe not every single one, and have that kind of discussion. The other thing that is that because of all these changes, they are not really able to be consistently mature. Actually, there can sometimes be a dip in maturity from, like the 10, 11, 12-year-old, and then, they get a little less mature. But anyway, a teenager can be, one day you can have a conversation with them and think, wow, they are really getting it, and they're mature, and they're great. And then the next day, they're doing something like incredibly stupid in the library that, you're sort of like one time in the Morgan Hill Library, the kid who was a great kid, and he was in there all the time, and one day I sort of smelled something, and he was out there in the teen section. He lit an incense stick. And I went up to him, really? Why did you think this was a good idea? In the library? But, it was like, well, okay, I'm going to try this, whatever. So that can really happen. So they have that tendency to sort of go off on side tracks that are a little bit bizarre. So the other thing is that they can be very dramatic at this age. Everything is a big deal. Everything is important. I think we think that we see this with girls more, although I have sons, and I certainly, would see it with them. middle son referred to 13 as the year of tears. Obviously, when he was much older. You know, but things could, you know, it can be tough. The other thing that they can also do is jump to conclusions. And again, that reasoning thing, they think that they're thinking things through, but sometimes their conclusions can be a little bit odd. And this is where, as an adult, it's really helpful to be, you know, a good listener, to ask those questions, to help them think it through and figure out how they got there and help them come to realizations themselves. Another thing that happens in the remodeling of the brain is that teenagers are actually not that great at recognizing the emotions of others. Part of this is their self-centeredness, but for a while teenagers are undergoing all these changes, they really are not good at recognizing other people's emotions. If you show teenagers pictures of faces, they are 20% or more less accurate in gauging the emotions that are depicted. And they get better at it after about age 18 or so. And so that's one of the reasons why they sometimes are not able to read the signs. When you think you're making it pretty clear that they're pushing it too far, but you know, they don't get that that's what you're doing. The flip side of that is that they, when teenagers are shown a neutral face in photographs, they often interpret it as angry or mean. And so sometimes even when we think that we're coming across as, you know, this is just regular me, I'm not angry with you or whatever, they can interpret it as mean. And again, part of it's that self-centeredness, and part of it is just that inability to gauge what other people are thinking. We were talking about this yesterday. Penny was reminding me that the term, if you'll excuse the language, that some teenagers have for what we think is just a perfectly normal, neutral expression is resting bitch face. And, you know, they think that you are, you know, somehow out to get them or me or whatever. So again, you want to work on that, you know, pleasant expression or developing that relationship so that you're having the conversation with them and they're not just seeing you as some barrier with that intentional look. And you see this happening with, even among themselves, you know, someone bumps into them, you know, they think it's on purpose, or if someone looks at them, they interpret it as a mean look. So, you know, sometimes again, you have to work through that. So what we, in the library especially, one of the things that we need to do is really try to determine if certain behaviors are really dangerous, in which, you know, property or people are getting hurt, you know, something it's really serious, or if it's just distracting, it's disruptive, it's annoying, it's irritating, we don't like it, the other patrons don't like it, but it's really might be actually developmentally appropriate. And as Penny pointed out before, from elementary school on up, and certainly in high school, one of the things that is happening now that wasn't happening even probably 20 years ago is a real emphasis on group work, on working on activities together. And if they're working in groups all the time in school, you know, they're going to be doing that in the library too when they're working on things after school. So, you know, we may want them to sit down and do their homework by themselves, but that's not how they do their homework. And, you know, this is sort of even, we see this in social media, that teens are much more likely to rely on, when they're trying to find information, they're much more likely to rely on information from friends or from other people, from people on social media, than they are actually looking up things. You know, we're all big on this, you know, authority of sources and that kind of thing, and we do need to teach that, but that's kind of not necessarily where they're coming from. So anyway, so dangerous behaviors, yeah, you have to deal with them immediately, firmly. Harm is going to happen, and also the thing about dangerous behaviors is it's going to create an environment in which other people, or other teens and other individuals in the library are going to feel unsafe, and so we want to do that. But some of the distracting behaviors are just developmentally appropriate, and what we might want to do is redirect them, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in a minute. One of the things about those distracting behaviors is that they can come from a lot of different ways. As Penny talked about with the kids, the latchkey kids that are in the school, and we certainly see this especially in the younger teenagers before they can drive and have more ability to go other places. They're kind of stuck there, and one, they might be hungry. And now that more of our libraries are allowing food in the library, that can be helpful, but other libraries, especially if you're in a branch in a neighborhood, there might be some place to send them to get food, because after school they may just be hungry. They may just need a little bit of exercise. When I worked at Morgan Hill, I used to occasionally, some of the rowdy kids, I would say, I think you need to go outside and run around the building about 3 times. Well, I was going to say you couldn't do it here, but actually you probably could, because there's a kind of lawn and courtyard out there. But a lot of us work in branches and suburban areas, and you can certainly do that. Another thing that it is a little hard to realize sometimes is they might just be tired. Teenagers are really chronically sleep deprived. Teenagers actually physically need like about 9 to 10 hours of sleep a night. And if any of you know teenagers, they're not getting that kind of sleep. For one thing, there's actually there's some really practical reasons why they're not. One is that the melatonin, which kicks in our bodies and tells us it's time to go to sleep, actually kicks in later at night in the teenage years than it does for adults. For adults, although I know everybody's different, but by about 10 o'clock at night, most of us is telling us, time to think about going to bed. Teenagers, it's more like 11 or 12. So they're really, when they say they're not tired, they're really not tired. Also, the fact that they're getting, the studies have shown, screen time. They're getting all this, blue light from the screen, and screen time it kind of delays that moment when they're ready for sleep. And then school starts some schools start as early as 7 in the morning, some of the high schools are even 8 o'clock, and if they haven't gotten to bed until midnight or 1 or 2, and then they're up at 6 to get ready for school, or they've got sports before school or something like that, they're tired. And all of you know that when you're tired, you're not your best self. You get cranky, and if you're hungry and tired, then you're really not your best self. You're cranky, you are more reactive to things, all of those kinds of things. So we have to kind of recognize that is also possibly going on. And if there are ways in our libraries that we can diffuse that a little bit by having opportunities for them to not sleep necessarily, but eat perhaps, or get some physical exercise or something like that, as well as other activities. A lot of programs, somebody was telling me yesterday about how they do they have their program room is, they do a game thing, every Wednesday or every other Wednesday or something like that. Some of those kind of programs. Another thing I find really useful, and again, especially for those kind of middle school and younger teen ages, is to have a good supply of passive programs on hand. Do people know what passive programs are? Who doesn't know? Okay, so a passive program is a kind of a program that doesn't require, a program room, a place, a specific time, that kind of thing. It's the kind of thing that you can give, just like we give coloring sheets to the preschoolers so that they can color while their parents are looking for books. You can have passive programs on hand in your desk for those bored kids, because sometimes they're just bored. And one of the, for example, scavenger hunt. You can have a sheet in your desk where you give it to them to go look up, find the find a book on such and such a topic, or, look on the databases for this, or do something. If you just Google library scavenger hunts, you'll find a million. Actually, if you just Google library passive programs, you'll find a lot of things. Teenagers are really like it, again, especially that middle school age, they really like the opportunity to share their own opinions about things. So if you have some bulletin board space or something like that, you can do a variety of things where you post a question and have them do it. You ask them to create tweets from their favorite, from a book character, or a playlist. Give me a playlist for such and such a book, and you can post it and other people can add to it. A book that everybody's read, like The Hunger Games or something. Or casting a movie. If there's a popular book, it hasn't been made a movie yet, or even if it has, who would you like to see star in this movie? And they can, write those things down. At Morgan Hill, once during April, during National Poetry Month, I bought a couple of boxes of magnetic poetry and put them on the end of a shelving range, a metal shelving range that was in the teen section. And we ended up keeping it up year-round because they would just love to stop by, make up poems. And actually, people ask me, in some of these things where you're asking them to contribute things, don't they, put bad words or do... Well, magnetic poetry, it's a little harder to do because the words mostly aren't in there. But, if you're keeping an eye on it, you can always... the thing about magnetic poetry is once it's up, somebody else is going to come along and move it and use the words in another poem, so you can always do that. Other kinds of things like giving them opportunities to help you in selection, giving you suggestions for materials that they would like to see in the collection, or writing little blurbs like shelf talkers on books that they like. I know one teen librarian who has just a little cart or shelving unit in which, and then there's a little box on it, and kids can fill out a little blurb on a book on a 3x5 card and drop it in. And then he goes through them periodically, sorts them, and gets those books off the shelf. And if they're like super popular, maybe just a picture of the cover, or a read-alike or a book by the same author, and then put those out on the shelf along with the card that have the teen written blurbs on it. And it's real popular. People, will come and look at that and pull those things off the shelf. It's like, I don't know about you, but I like to look at the just returned book card in the library because often, it's good stuff. Somebody thought enough of it to check it out, so, it must be okay. So those are some of the kinds of things that you can do in that dealing with the, the kids that are just really bored. So approaches to teens. Again, just as with anybody else in the library, a lot of this is the kind of common sense that we know from dealing with customers in the library, to be customer-centered, to be open-minded, to be empathetic, and in the case of teens, I think this does mean having some awareness of what they are going through as a teenager. It's just like we would for being aware that a child is autistic or someone else has some other kind of thing. We try to understand that they are different, and they are different for a reason. That doesn't mean we excuse them, but it means we can be empathetic and think about how we're going to cope with that. This one may sound a little funny, but know your library collections and your technology. This goes back again to that thing about teens being really kind of hypersensitive to adult hypocrisy, or how adults are behaving. And if you're the expert, they expect you to be the expert, and they expect you to know what you've got. And if you can't, it doesn't mean you have to know everything, but it really, if you're dealing with teens on a regular basis in the library, it really behooves you to know what the databases are that are going to be the most effective in their homework, and to help them do it, help to know how to use them, so that you're not standing up there saying, well, there might be something, I'm not exactly sure how to do this research, and, you're sitting there fumbling. And if you can't do it, you should need to know who in your library might be the person that, can help you with that. Because, again, they're quick to dismiss you if you're not going to be helpful to them. And if you're not going to be helpful to them, why should they bother to come back? Treat everyone with respect. Obviously, I said, that's kind of a duh sort of thing. And learn the names of your regular library users. Although, as I always point out, don't only use their name when you're disciplining them. I think we have a tendency to do that sometimes. Think, well, I'll learn their name, and then I'll be able to get them when they're not behaving the way I want them to. Part of the treating with respect and knowing who they are too is a case of. Now I forgot what I was going to say. Well, let me go back to the names. So anyway, one of the things that happens is that in groups, especially teams, you will often find that if you just observe for a while, you will notice that the uproar, the commotion, the things that are happening will often center around one person, one or two people. There are often, they're kind of the leader of the group, even if it's not anything, if you ask them, they wouldn't necessarily say that, but just like any group of people, some personalities are going to more control, the action of what's going on in others. And if you can identify who that person is, learn their name, and learn ways to either, that might be the person that you have to kick out, because that person, they will often, be, well, I didn't do anything, it was so-and-so. But if you've been watching and you know that it was at their instigation, that might be the person you kick out, and then things settle down. Or, alternatively, and probably more productively, if that can be the person that you can kind of get on your side, you can get that person to contribute by taking some ownership of what's going on in the library, taking some, asking their opinion about things, getting them, then that can change the dynamic in the whole group. So one of the things as far as dealing with teens when you're going to discipline them, one of the critical things really is to stay on message. Like I mentioned before, they're going to try to get you off, to try to get you to offer other choices. So you need to repeat yourself if necessary. You need to avoid offering additional choices once you've given them a choice of how to behave. And because if you allow yourself to be distracted in that way, then they've succeeded in not having to change their behavior, because they've gotten you off topic. So you want to be firm about it, and this is why it's helpful to have specific rules, and like I said before, to be really consistent about them. Another thing that can be really helpful with teenagers is to help them practice effective coping strategies, especially when they're dealing with things like, being excluded from the group, or bored, or various kinds of things, ability to gauge other people's responses. And so you can help them by talking through that. You can be that person in their life, maybe, especially if they're in the library all the time, who is the non-parent adult or non-teacher adult who, really treats them respectfully and is helping them, move through some of those tough situations. I think sometimes as parents in particular, and teachers to some extent, we try to solve teenagers' problems too quickly instead of letting them work through what are the ramifications and what might they do. Sometimes with a teenager, the best response is to ask them what they think the consequences should be, or what they think the outcome will be if such and such a thing would happen, and have them help you work through that together. Again, all this takes time, and sometimes it can be really difficult to do if, there's only a couple people in the library and there's lots of people there, all of that kind of thing. But it does help them learn some of those skills for the future. Another way to talk to teens is to use a common feedback practice. It's called a sandwich, where you've heard this in other kind of courses where you've got the positive, then the negative, and then the positive. So for example, something like, I'm really glad you chose to come to the library this afternoon. I'm happy to have you here and that you find the library a valuable place. However, your behavior with others shows me that you don't really value that this space is not just yours alone, but it's for other people. And your noise is disrupting, that study group or, whatever the action is. Now, you can choose to quiet down and stay, or if you don't think that you can do that, and you don't feel that you can control yourself, you can leave the library. I really hope that you will choose to settle down and stay, because I'm glad to have you here and I'd like to be able to continue to help you. But if you can't, you're going to have to. So, it's up to you. It's your decision. So giving them that choice, but also doing it, in an encouraging way is one way to do it. Then, if you do have to kick them out, I think, for me, one of the really important things is to say, something like, and I'll be happy to see you when you come back tomorrow and maybe you're in a better space. And when they do come back tomorrow, it's a fresh start, okay? We don't greet them at the door with, wow, I really hope today is a better day than yesterday. Boy, that was a disaster. Because that just sets them up for, it almost gets them, like, oh, okay, well then, let's see what I can come up with today. But rather, it's fresh start. It's new. We're starting over. We're assuming that, today is the day. Today's their mature day. Yesterday was their immature day, or whatever it is. My personal practice, for most things, for these things that come in the distracting behavior, the less serious things with the noise, the uproar, the, whatever. It's that, you're out of the library for the day, but you can come back tomorrow and we'll start over again. There will certainly be occasions in which you're going to have to impose a more serious thing, and that might be, again, the more dangerous behaviors, like Penny mentioned before, or if they actually hurt someone, or if they're stealing from someone or something like that, you may have to say, well, you can't come back to the library for a week, and before you can start coming back on a regular basis, you need to bring your parent with you so that we can have a discussion, all of us together. And we'll talk a little bit about those discussions with the parents later. You can do different things. I was reading behavior guidelines for some library, and I don't remember what it was, but it was for the online course I was teaching. And one of them was that they would kick, such and such a behavior, the teenager would not be allowed to come back to the library for a year. I was like, a year? Oh my gosh. It's like, I know, especially when I was at Morgan Hill, that I had staff members who would have been very, very happy if I had said that kid cannot come back to the library for a year. But we are here for the public. We're trying to help them, and with teenagers, we're trying to help them grow. And by excluding them from that opportunity, that's not going to be a help. And you know what? They do actually go. I had a kid at Morgan Hill who was just one of my constant problems. He was kicked out more times than, like everybody else combined, but he would come back. But he was a very sweet, personable kid, but, he just, whatever. So, like 5 years later, he's in his 20s, he's in his early 20s, he comes into the library and he says, hi do you remember me? Oh, yes. He said, you kicked me out of the library a lot of times. Oh, yes, I remember that. And you know what? He told me that he had actually, I mean, you know, obviously whatever these behaviors were, he had other problems. He had gotten suspended from school and that kind of stuff, but he finished. He actually didn't, I think he even not managed to make it into continuation school, because he told me he got his GED and then he went to National Hispanic University and he got his degree and he was working and he was like a regular person, you know. But again, he was like maybe in his, you know, he was like maybe 23 or something like that, you know, and some of that cerebral cortex remodeling had happened and that kind of thing. So, but I was, you know, I was actually personally really proud that despite the fact that I had to kick him out of the library on numerous occasions, including the time that he had a gun, which actually didn't turn out to be a real gun, but, you know, people didn't know that at first, the ones, the kids he was brandishing in front of. That he had actually, you know, still had a positive feeling towards the library and towards me, you know, when he came back some years later. So I think keeping those relationships is one of the key things that we can do. Okay, so I talked about some of this. Again, one of the things, you know, if we can preserve their dignity in front of the other teens, again, they've got that self-consciousness. So we want to, if possible, to try to pull them off to the side for the discipline. It also is really helpful. It helps you from getting into those things because, you know, if you're talking to one kid in front of a group of other kids, then they start chiming in with their, you know, it's like, no, he didn't do that, he did that, he did, you know, and, oh no, he didn't say that, he said, you know, it's like, you're not gonna, it's not gonna work. You don't want to be in a conversation with 3 or 4 kids. You want to just have the one-on-one. And again, you don't want to back them into that corner. Give them those opportunities. So basically, the basic choices, like I mentioned before, are they can stay, but the behavior has to change, or if they can't change the behavior, that they need to leave. And again, we're focusing on behavior here, not people. It's not the person who's unacceptable or bad, it's the behavior that is not appropriate for the library. So, let me just go back a couple of other things. No, that is actually it. Okay, so what we're going to do now is just, again, a little opportunity for you to contribute and think about the way this works. I want to share with you, this is on your reading list. This is a book, it's a fairly new book, it only came out about a year ago, called Brainstorm. It's by Daniel Siegel, MD. And it's called, the subtitle is The Power and Purpose of the Teenage Brain. And it's really useful for giving you ways to look at how the teenage brain works. And Siegel says, among other things, that he talks about 4 kind of activities or 4 things that are happening in the brain in the teenage years and how they all have, some of them we've talked about before in various ways, but they all have their upsides and their downsides, their positive sides and their negative side. And the 4 things are novelty seeking. So this is that increased drive for rewards, that you know, wanting to get that pleasure center, that limbic center, you know, hitting that and not really caring about the consequences. It creates motivation to try new things and to live and feel life more fully. The second is increased social engagement. So this is that connectedness with peers and creating new friendships. The third is increased emotional intensity, which, you know, again, that enhanced vitality to life, and you know that, you know, everything is important and a big deal. And the fourth is creative exploration. So it's that expanded sense of consciousness, that ability to do the abstract thinking, conceptual thinking, you know, to really begin to start questioning the status quo, and start coming up with out-of-the-box strategies and new ideas. This is also when we see, a lot of teenagers really get engaged in things like music or dance or art or whatever it might be, that they really start being able to express themselves in those ways. So I'd just like you, just for maybe just 2 or 3 minutes, just to talk to the people around you, pairs or 3 or 4, whatever it was, and just sort of make yourself a little list of what you think the upsides and the downsides to each of those things are, and then we'll get back together and share something for everybody. So what are some of the upsides for the novelty-seeking behavior? What are some of the positives for that? Who's got one? Yeah.
Adventure.
Adventure.
Thrills.
Yeah, thrills. I mean, in a positive way, yeah. Looking for new things. What else? Yeah?
Happy. I see them that very happy hanging around with their friends.
Happiness, yeah. It makes them happy, yeah.
Where they come up with creative solutions to problems.
Yeah, coming up with creative solutions to problems, absolutely. Yeah, we definitely see that, yeah.
They potentially find things that they're really good at.
Potentially find things that they're really good at, yeah. All those are definite upsides. And just that kind of passion for life, being open to change, the sense of adventure, yeah, all of those things that you said. How about the downsides? What are some possible negatives? Danger, yeah, having that, sense of going for the novelty to the detriment of, the thinking it through, and pregnancy, incarceration, all of those are possible. Incarceration, pregnancy, I'm sorry.
They can really dismiss the value of things as they are.
That's a good point, yeah, dismissing the value of things as they are, overlooking something just because, they're looking for something new. I think that one was pretty obvious to most people. How about the social engagement? What are the positives, upsides to the social engagement drive? Nobody can think of one? Yeah.
Volunteering and volunteering in groups with their friends. If you can get someone to volunteer, you can get other ones to volunteer. Well, it's a place to come together and socialize.
Right, volunteering, so you're not just engaging with the general public, but possibly volunteering with friends so that you're doing things in a group, and so you've got social engagement on that level too. What else? Yes?
Forming really strong bonds with other people.
Forming really strong bonds with other people. Yeah, and research shows that people who have strong supportive relationships and friendships are all through life are healthier, they're happier, have more well-being. Who here has a friend that is still their friend today that they made in junior high or high school? Yeah, lots of people. And those are some of the closest, strongest friendships we have. Even if we go very different ways, those are people who really can support us. Other upsides? How about downsides to the social engagement piece?
Getting into the wrong crowd.
I'm sorry?
Getting involved in the wrong crowd.
Getting too involved with their own crowd, yeah, and not being open to either outsiders or adults. I mean, sometimes being so involved with their peer group that they don't have interactions with adults, which can actually ultimately be detrimental to their growth and so on. What else? Other downsides? Yeah.
Social media bullying.
Bullying, yeah, especially on social media, but obviously it still happens in person as well.
Bad decisions.
Bad decisions because of other people in the group are making those decisions. Yeah. Those are good. Let's see if I have anything else. No, I think that's pretty good. How about the increased emotional intensity? What are some of the upsides on that?
Maybe too much, but they still get to value.
They value the importance of things. Maybe too much, but stuff matters. Things matter. Yeah, that's a good one. What else?
They can become
increasingly engaged in things because it matters.
Right, become engaged in things because it matters. I mean, this in a way goes back to the, the volunteer stuff, being engaged in the world. What else?
The whole dating scene of the guys and the girls who are emotionally intense and then they have emotional breakups. They're very destructive and the whole world comes to an end. You can see this in the library too.
Yeah, we get to see the whole lifespan of the relationship. Zest for being alive.
But if you can experience a range of emotions, perhaps when it is a little bit more safer to have them as a teenager rather than as a working person in your office, that's kind of an advantage. If you learn, this is what it's like when I'm mad, this is what it's like when I'm...
So learning about that range of emotions and learning what they are in a more safe environment. How about the downsides for that increased emotional intensity? More emotional outbursts that then affect other people. Somebody in the back is doing that exploding head thing. Yeah. What else? Yeah.
Well, like being bipolar, going really down.
Yeah. I think that's a big one. Being having lows that are so low, moodiness, and even to the extreme of depression and that kind of thing. Yeah. What else? Taking everything personally. Yeah. All of those are. Okay, how about the creative exploration? What are some of the upsides on that?
They're good with music and craft and things like that, so they really pursue in the future.
Okay, yeah, they find something, some creative expression that they want to continue with for the rest of their life, that they want to even on a casual basis. Yeah, absolutely. What else? Yeah. Innovation again. What else?
Selfishly for the library, great displays.
Yeah. Again, if you let them help you on that, you can get some good displays and good things. How about the downsides? Or on the creative exploration? This one's a little harder to do for some people to think what it might be, but yeah.
They can disregard safety.
Can disregard safety in the pursuit of whatever it is, okay?
Graffiti?
Like graffiti, yeah, a couple of people mentioned that. Yeah, no, absolutely, that could be, or to disregard sort of societal norms or expectations. Yeah.
For the adult world, sometimes that's cool, but you're totally disrupting our environment, and so you're like, don't do that, but do it, just not here,
Yeah, sometimes adults, we don't want them doing that because it's disruptive to us. Yeah. I think the other thing that Siegel mentions in terms of that is that it can actually lead to a bit of a crisis of identity as they're looking for these things, or maybe they're feeling that they're not succeeding or that their friend is succeeding in some endeavor, and they don't have that. They're not sure what is going to be, a little bit of lack of direction and purpose and that kind of thing. So those are all some of the things that again Siegel talks about. I wanted to mention just one other thing too when I was talking about the teens and their perceptions, like their perceptions of emotions and understanding what other people are thinking. On your handout there is a link to a TED Talk by Sarah Blakemore, who's a neuroscientist who works with kind of what she calls the social brain. It's only about 15 minutes long, but it is really worth taking a look at in terms of getting the sense of what teenagers, how they perceive things and how that changes over the teenage years. So I really encourage you to take a look at that to get more insight. It's a TED Talk video. It should be on your sheet. Okay, so now Penny is going to come back and we're going to talk a little bit about parents.
Okay. All right, I'm green. I'm go green.
Finally. Thank you. We're going to have some tips for talking to parents. Whenever you have to talk to a parent about something that could be unpleasant or sensitive, you want to think about good customer service rules, how you would want to be approached if you were going to be spoken to. I think it is really important to meet with the parent in private. And again, it's helpful if there could be 2 staff members, one that does most of the talking, one as a witness. And if you're talking about rules that are violated, to have those in a written form. People are very sensitive nowadays about profiling and how one group of people are pinned down to behave a certain way and others don't have to. So if it's a written rule, it's much easier to convey that this is something all of us need to follow. So I'm going to get into more of some specific things on that. But up next, we're going to talk about parents of teenagers.
Yeah, most of it, I think it's...
I think you might need to have yours on.
Oh, okay.
I was going to say, it probably needs to switch over. Okay, oh, there we go. Okay, so again, most of the things that Penny's going to talk about in terms of dealing with parents apply, to parents with teens as well. But I think there's a couple of different things about dealing with teens, and one of them is to really acknowledging that they are growing and they are able to take more responsibility for their own life, their own, whatever it is, their homework, their circulation record, their fines, whatever it might be. And I think we can help them do that. And obviously one of the ways is to make a point. So when the parent and the teen approach together is to, address our comments to the teens. Now the parent, will often come up and say, well, my son needs, blah, 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 blah. But, if we can address the question to the teen and try to draw him out. The thing with teens, too, especially if, depending on what the topic is or what the situation is, some of them may be reluctant to talk in front of their parents. And so one of the things, we can, accept that input from the parents as much as we can. But, give the information to the teen and say, do you think this fulfills, what your need is? Is this what you're looking for? Is this the kind of thing that you want? One of the things, too, is at that age, they're old enough that, and sometimes, and you just have to gauge this from what you see of the parent and how the parent and the teen are interacting. Sometimes it might be that, you have a sense that you might have a better interaction if, the parent weren't there. So maybe you can sort of divide it into parts where you give the parent, take the parent to one section of the stacks and give them an area to look at, and then say to the teen, well, why don't you come with me? We're going to go look in this other area where there might be something, or give the parent a load of things to sort through while you take the teen to the computer and say, here, let's look at the databases while your mom is looking through these things. And that way you have that opportunity to have a little bit of a conversation with them. And I really feel like the same thing goes for when they're dealing with their, with their circulation record, with their fines and fees or whatever. Now their parent may ultimately be the one who's paying for it or not. But, if we can, I think we're actually helping them, develop some life skills. Well, so you understand that this is, this was overdue, you didn't turn it in, and then you turned it in, several weeks late, and these fines came up, or you never brought it back, and we have to replace it, and explaining what the situation is. They're old enough to understand that and to have that conversation with you. So I think we're going to talk a little bit more about dealing with parents who object to reading material and that kind of thing, and that's that's going to happen, and the parent certainly has the right to say what their teen can read or not read. I think one of the things when we're dealing with parents of teens that can be useful if you have that relationship with the parent, and you don't always, but some of them are parents who are willing to engage in that conversation is, well, maybe you both need to read it and you need to talk about what it is that, concerns you about this book. Or maybe it's just, well, I'm really sorry that this suggestion that I made wasn't appropriate for your child. Let's find something else, that will meet his needs, but also, your approval. And, maybe you just need to continue to come with him to the library if you're concerned that he's going to check out things that you don't like. And that's, we don't necessarily like that as librarians, but, that's the family dynamic that, we kind of have to live with.
I'm going to keep using that one. I just thought it was easier to, a lot of times with what we call the helicopter parent, where the parent takes over the reference interview with children, and that can be 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th graders, 7th graders even. I try to do several of the same things that Sarah just mentioned. I go ahead and talk to both people. I don't ace out the parent, but very often the parent wasn't in class and they don't know exactly what the child needs, yet they're dominating the situation. If you all had that experience, we've all had that experience. So what I try to do is with body language and eye contact, make sure that the child gets their opportunity to say, what did the teacher say? Oh, your mom and I were in class. So it would help both of us if you could tell us what the teacher said. And sometimes even something like that is enough for the parent to pause and really listen. Because even though they might have an older child that had the same teacher, same assignment, maybe the assignment's different now. You never know. So I try to do that and let the child talk. I let the parent talk too. If you have a child and parent who are basically asking for 2 different things, and the parent says they really need such and such, and the child said, well, I think the teacher wants me to have this other thing. I offer them both, and hopefully they'll check both out, and then they can figure it out later with the teacher or whatever. So that's the kind of thing that happens often. Does anybody have anything about helicopter parents they want to ask or advise? Yes?
Sometimes the parent takes over.
Sometimes the parent takes over.
Yes, and then the child just wanders off.
Yeah, if the parent takes over and the child wanders off, that's an excellent example. I would just be really very clear, oh, don't walk off, we need your help too. And because we weren't in class, and you're maybe only 2nd grade, but we need you to tell us what the teacher said. And just keep doing that. But still also, unlike the teenage situation where it can be more useful for the parent to kind of be given some busy work, because the teen is reluctant to talk. The child is not, it's not quite the same thing. We do need both of them, yes.
So sometimes you'll get a parent and the parent is trying to assign the kid extra work. Like, my child needs to learn math, so I want a really nice math book. Do you
Sometimes you'll have a parent who wants to teach a 3-year-old to read, or they want special, some of this can come across as an ethnic stereotype, but there are some parents who want their kid to win the spelling bee and be in geometry and trigonometry when they're 8. Those kind of things are really difficult to achieve, but I say, I don't know that family. I'll give them as much as I can and let that kind of see how it works. I don't think it's my place to tell them, you can't make your child do that.
Sometimes I feel like it's the parent's reference need. Has nothing to do with the child.
She's supposed to just say it's the parent's reference need.
Would you try to bring the child into that?
Yes, I try to, when the parent is asking, especially for extra work during the summer or vacations or things, I try to have the child help. And I also try to give a little commercial that free reading time can really be important to these things. Yes, we want to get the spelling bee book and practice, but also recreational reading will increase their vocabulary and give them more opportunities to learn new words to spell, so let's get both. And the parent usually will listen because they realize most librarians are teachers, too, in a way. And so they kind of will understand. So long as you're giving them what the parent asking for, they're usually willing to take something else as well, because you'll know that this is really probably more useful. Does that make sense?
Yes. Thank you.
That's a great question, thank you. There are a couple of times when we do need to talk to the parent without the child, and these are those sensitive issues. Parents will come up and ask about, I need a book about a death in the family, which could include the pet, sex education, divorce, or other issues like that, especially if it's for younger children, and they'll need a picture book about it, a story. Sometimes a story is going to help more than a nonfiction book about a death of a pet. They'll identify more with the storybook. And sometimes that's called bibliotherapy. And those kind of conversations, often the parent will want without the child there. And that's okay. That's a very appropriate time where the child's input maybe wouldn't be very helpful because it would be too alarming to them. So in that case, I conduct a regular reference interview, find out how old the child is. If they're asking about death, I've asked parents, is it a pet or a family member? And sometimes it'll be real specific. It's grandma's in hospice, and I want to help my 4-year-old prepare my 8-year-old, whatever it is. And we'll find good books, and often an online catalog can be good for that. For picture books, I use an old reference book called A to Zoo that's revised quite often. And sometimes that's the best go-to for those sensitive issue books. And then, of course, sometimes a sex education book, it's important that the parent make that choice of what's going to be appropriate for their family, because different families have different cultural standards of what's going to work. Sometimes the request is really out of the ordinary, which kind of relates back to what you were saying about the extra work, where they want a physics book for a 3-year-old. Well, we have some basic physics books that are really super simple, or books about gravity, or things like that. And that's okay. But sometimes they do want something, and there's just nothing written for that age level. Even something as simple as a potty training book for somebody 1-year-old. Most of them are written for people that are about 2 or 2.5, because you don't usually do potty training at age 1. It just doesn't work. Unless somebody has an example that I've never experienced, but that's the way it is. So what I do in those cases is don't tell the person, oh, you're wrong for asking for that. That's very negative. I try to show them, here are the potty training books. You might notice that most of them seem to talk about a 2-year-old. So check them out. And that would include parenting books as well as those simple go into the potty story books. And kind of see what's going to work, and whether this is a good time to do this or whether you want to wait. But here are the books so you can decide. That way you don't sound like a judgmental jerk, because nothing can, that just makes it harder for you to help them later. Once you've given them the information, they will usually take that to make the right choice. So that's my experience on sensitive issues. Any others people want to ask about? Sensitive issue books are pretty common, and often that is a very positive library experience for the parent when you can help them with those. The opposite are those difficult conversations. This is when you have to talk to the parent about a misbehaving child. As I mentioned before, I like to take the parent into a private space to talk about it. Sometimes even away from the child, depends on what it is. So that you can get the parent on board saying, this is what happened after school with your 10-year-old. We found out that they were bullying this other child. Let's work on this together and, talk to the child about what the rules are, about you can't do that kind of thing. And sometimes the parent will understand, and they'll be your best ally because you've empowered them to be the one to talk to their child about it. It is helpful to have anything written down, but not every rule has to be written. You don't have to have in your library policy that you cannot spit on the floor. There's certain common sense things. And what's great about kids, a lot of those are written in their school rules, detailing about what is bullying behavior. So you don't have to necessarily have all that same definition in your library policy. You could rely on the school's definition of bullying and say, we notice this behavior that we know the school prohibits and we think is also very negative. Can you help us? That kind of thing. And I also try to, once I've had the parent on board talking to the child, I try to make it really positive in that as soon as the child can stop the behavior, they're still welcome at the library. Did you want to say something? Yeah.
Well, I was just thinking about, well, one of the things we were talking about earlier about being engaged with our school partners in this, and sometimes this can help too, because if you've already had the conversation, with somebody from the school, with the principal or somebody, and you know that you're both having the same issues with the child, that can sometimes help you in that conversation with the parent. That because you know that this isn't news to them. This isn't the first time that that Josh did whatever it is that he's doing, because he's done it at school too. So that was just one thing I was thinking. And this is a little bit off of this topic, but I was thinking before about what we were talking about the kids who don't necessarily, want to tell you their name or whatever when they're in trouble. And Penny was talking about, again, those getting engaged with the school. And this kind of goes back to knowing the names too, because again, in Morgan Hill, I knew the principals, I knew, some of the different things, and this worked especially well with the Catholic school kids, but, when you would say to them, so what do you think Mrs. Hanson would think if I told her that you were doing, X, Y, and Z, and they'd be like, Mrs. Hanson? Oh, yes. And also, we actually had a situation where we were at a period of time when we were having some trouble where we had talked to the principal and the high school principal and the middle school principals would actually do walkthroughs of the library, a couple of times a week, so that the kids knew that, that they knew. And also, at one time, they had one of those, what do they call them, community support officers or something, somebody that worked for the police department that was basically assigned to the school. And she would also come and do walkthroughs of the library every once in a while, just so that the kids understood that there was a presence, that we knew each other. But again, I think it helps with the parents as well.
Thank you. So sometimes you're having a discussion about the misbehaving child, but often the discussion is more about that the parent is breaking the rule, which we talked about a little bit with the latchkey kids. So I think it is really important to know what your policy is, of what age is a child too young, and sometimes that can be confusing to parents. And I had an example just before I retired a couple years ago, where a parent left a child and went on an errand. The 6-year-old was left, he was playing a computer game, but we were more concerned that he was left to supervise his 4-year-old sister. But in that family's, because they were new to the United States, it was normal for a 6-year-old to supervise a 4-year-old. Here in America, that's probably not generally the case in a public place, much less at home by yourself. So we had a translator. It wasn't me, but we did have a staff member who could talk to the person in that language, explain your children weren't being bad, but this place is full of strangers, strange adults, and it's just not safe for you to leave them without somebody older to supervise. And she was really nice about it and understood that because we stressed that it wasn't the child at fault, it was a rule for the child's safety, and we tried our best to talk to her in a very non-judgmental way. And she was cool with that after that. But you get those kind of situations, and people come from places where young children are responsible for their younger siblings. It's a normal thing. And we just have to let them know that for us it's an issue with safety. So that kind of thing. And so we bent over backwards to not insult their culture. That we understood that was normal at their house. But in the library, it was unfortunately, we couldn't go, make that happen. And to be quite honest, the 6-year-old, he was so involved in his video game, he wasn't doing the best job of watching his little sister. And that can happen even with a 10, 11, 12-year-old. Yes?
So sort of similarly, do you have any advice about what to do if the child that is supervising it is old enough, is like, say 16, supervising a 2-year-old, but just is not very good at it?
Well, I had adults who were, this one lady who she was very outspoken about all kinds of things having to do with the library. And she was very involved, and I think she was also very well educated, just based on talking to her and getting to know her. And she often would come with other kids besides her own, and she didn't watch them either. And some of them were very little and would walk away. So it isn't just the teenager's fault, it's everybody. And it's a case-by-case basis where you have to remind whoever is in charge of a little child. I've had parents who will go to the second floor and leave a 4-year-old. I had a 4-year-old who spoke absolutely no English and was new to America, and his father was outside talking on the phone and smoking. You just have to tell each of those people, we realize, we appreciate that that children are welcome at the library. Unfortunately, because it's so big and so busy, you have to have them within eyesight if they're under this certain age, and we had it written in the policy. Yeah, and it's all kinds of different people, not any certain culture. Yeah.
When you see a child without parents, how do you approach them?
Well, because I was the children's librarian for so long, even if I wasn't on duty, they would usually have me do it, and talk to that person. Or there might be a certain staff member that's there regularly, like not necessarily the librarian. We had Miss Loanne at one of our branches. She was the checkout desk person. She also did story time. And so she would go and talk to the child. So usually there's a person who's good at talking to the child, checking out, did you come with a grown-up? Is your grown-up still here? Should we call them on the phone? Things like that. Yeah. Did you want to ask something else? Yeah. And now with cell phones, it's easier. And I've been around so long, back then, people didn't have a phone on them, so that made it harder. Yes.
We had a student there, a child, and the father was stepping out.
Yeah.
Our librarian asked him, but he just went off on her.
Yes, I've had people go off on me for that.
She didn't really say anything.
Yeah.
He just kept going at her and whatever.
Yeah.
Finally, he said, I don't want to talk to you anymore.
Okay, then I'll have the security guard talk to you, and we'll call family services, because I don't play. Yeah. I've had people go off on me, and that's exactly what I've told them. This is for the safety of your child, and I don't play.
A few hours later, he called and apologized.
Yeah. But you know what, when you're a librarian, to be quite frank, I used to run a bar for one thing, which is true. But I also, when you're a librarian for a long time, in a smaller town, you're the big fish in the small pond, you can be kind of outspoken like that, unfortunately. Which means if you're newer, it can be helpful to have two people go up and talk to that person.
Well, I was standing there with her.
Yeah, well, that's good.
He said, I don't want to talk to you anymore.
Yeah.
And I was like, she wasn't being rude to you. And he was like, but did you hear? And I said, she wasn't being rude to you.
Yeah. And especially in that situation, sometimes that can come across as threatening, and you might say, I'm going to have to. Now, we had security guards at one point, but the branch library, they didn't hire a security guard till after I retired because they didn't need one. Not to brag, but that's a true story. But then you would call 911 if people were like that. We just have a few minutes left, and I just want to quickly say that you'll deal with parents who want to ban a book, which I think is hilarious, because usually, especially if it's a middle school or a high school kid, no better publicity to get people to read a book is to tell them that it's banned. But I think it's really helpful if your library has a policy that the parent has to fill out a form. Also, I think it's important that we know that every family is different, and if a parent says their child, even a teenager, should not read a book, that's up to that family. And I also think it's really important to just listen and just let the person talk and talk. And I told this story yesterday. I had one lady talk for at least 10 minutes about how Harry Potter was going to send us all to the devil. And then finally, at the end of her talking, me just listening, I said, we have over 200 holds on the new Harry Potter I appreciate, and your child doesn't, shouldn't have to read it, but we're not going to pull the copies. It's just not going to happen. And she goes, I appreciate that. And she left. Didn't even fill out the form. So I think the customer service of really good listening skills can really help when a person's trying to ban a book. Because especially in the Bay Area, people know that they're on the wrong side of history for banning a book because we're such a progressive area, and they're much more likely to object to a book that's like a Huckleberry Finn, where they don't like an ethnic slur in the book. But then in those cases, we usually still have those books because they're on school reading lists. And in some ways, even at the public library, it's on the school reading list. That's part of our mission, is to support the school. Let's see if we can find an alternative for your child. But you can't pull the books, and they realize that too. Now we have a few minutes left for questions. Any other last situations that people want to ask? And if you think of any too, when time is out, please email us too. Yes?
How do you deal with parents who come to the library and say, my son needs XYZ book for, about something for his homework?
And the child is not there?
The child is not there.
That happens, and I serve them. And I usually do most of the work myself, because I dealt with a lot of families that English was still a struggle. So I wouldn't make them look it up in the computer, any of that. I try my best to find out what the information was, and often at that point it's like a shopping list and they have it written down. It's definitely neat, they know what the child needs. And then I would just give it to them and check it out. I don't think it's my place, this is just my opinion of course, to tell the parent you have to bring the child. Sometimes I'll mention, especially if it happened more than once, if your child comes, I'll show them how to look up the book, but you don't know the child's schedule. They might have medical appointments on a regular basis, or play a sport. And this is another true story. I used to wait, I was old enough, when Jason Kidd was still in high school, a basketball player, his sister would come and get books for him. And I knew where he was and why he couldn't come. And I certainly didn't tell her. She had to tell Jason Kidd in high school, when he was going to the Catholic school in Alameda, that he had to come. I'd get the books and she took them to him. I did see him once. He did come to the library once.
I have a question about my previous question. When you see the kid and you know that he's lost and he's looking for his parents, and when you approach him, he's kind of scared you're going to do something wrong. So how do you approach? How do you answer?
When a child is scared,
like you see the face and...
Usually a child in the library, and this is unfair, but often a female, they'll be more relaxed around. A female that looks like a grandma or a helper, and they'll let that person help them, And so sometimes it's also a good point to have two people, because then you have a witness that we're both going to help you find your grown-up. We'll walk around with you. And I usually don't touch them unless I knew them, because they gave story time all the time, that kind of a thing. So there is ways of doing that. We had stuffed animals and puppets we used a lot, and that was very comforting to a lost child. Yeah. And somebody over here did have a question or comment? Yes?
Oh, I did. How do you handle, or good tips on handling the parents who try to offload their responsibility for disciplining their children onto the librarian?
Well, that can be a cultural thing too. So I try to let them know the most effective way is if we partner in this situation, but you also have to pick your battles. And so sometimes if the parent is really feeling that, I will go ahead and be the disciplinarian, because I'm going to see that kid on a regular basis, and I see that their parent is telling them, you better do what that lady says. In fact, I'm going to have her tell you what to do, so that can help.
Yeah. I think the other thing too is that with parents, and especially again as the kids are older, that we have to be really clear with them. I can do this, but you have to do that. Because, I've had parents who, said, well, you have to make sure that, he never checks out a book, about such and such, or you have to make sure that he never uses bad language in front of the other kids. I think, I got 1,200 people coming in this library every day. Your kid is one of them. I can't be everywhere at once. this is what I can do. I can make suggestions to him about this. I can discipline him just as I would anyone else if I catch him doing something. But, you know, it's your responsibility to set the expectations for your son. And if you don't think, if you and he don't think that he can meet them in the library, then maybe you need to come with him to the library. I think we have to be really clear about what we can do and
Is that
what they
you meant?
have to
I
do.
misunderstood, I'm sorry. No. I was thinking of the other situation where a parent is hesitant and they, in some ways, they want me to be the one telling the rule, but they're standing right next to me nodding. That's what I meant. But what Sharon is saying is just as important. We do have to tell parents that we are not babysitters. Hey, for one thing, there is way too many people, but even if the library is really slow, I have a million other things to do. And it's not my job, you know? I wouldn't say that, but you kind of indicated that we don't control what your child checks out, you do. That kind of thing.
Because I don't like the parents putting the librarian in the position of being the one to be feared, especially for little children.
Right. Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
I kind of like that.
But then if I'm talking to a little child about a broken rule, I try to do it in a way that isn't really negative, saying, so all of us can be happy, we're going to do this. And when you're the storytelling lady, it can come across that way, to be quite frank. And so that can help. So sometimes you might need to get that employee to help you talk to a smaller child. But that's true. You don't want the parent to make you be the police.
I do have to let them go, so we're not impinging on your lunch hour.
Yes.
So thank you all very much for coming. We'll hang around here for a few minutes if you want to ask a question. And feel free to